FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In today's episode, I interview retired Supervisory Special Agent Jim Wedick. Jim served in the FBI for nearly 35 years, and he talks about his assignment in the late 1970s as an undercover agent in the Bureau's very first long-term international undercover investigation. The case marked a significant shift in the FBI's priorities and was the first time that the Bureau operated a sophisticated attack on organized crime networks and financial criminals using white-collar crime violations. He also talks about several cases that he worked when assigned to the Sacramento Division. Before we get to the interview, I want to let you know where I am. I'm actually in sunny Deerfield Beach, Florida, attending Sleuth Fest 2016. Now, Sleuth Fest is a writers' conference presented by the Florida chapter of Mystery Writers of America. And at this conference, there are authors who write mysteries, crime fiction, and thrillers. The conference is a great opportunity to study the craft, the writing craft, and to network. The guest of honor for the conference is C.J. Box. Now, C.J. Box is a New York Times bestselling author of 18 novels, and he is known for his Joe Pickett series. I picked up one of his books to read on the plane on the way back, 3 weeks to say goodbye. My understanding, it is a departure from the type of book that C.J. Box is normally known for, but it looked pretty interesting. So I'm going to read it on the plane, and I'll tell you what I thought about it next week. And now, here's the show. I am excited and absolutely thrilled to introduce my guest for today, Jim Wedick. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Jerry. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Now, the last episode, I forgot to mention that the agent that I was interviewing had actually been a supervisor before he retired, and I didn't give him his due. So I want to introduce you as a retired Supervisory Special Agent Jim Wedick.
Sure. Why, thank you for that. Yes, I did run the corruption and healthcare fraud squad here when I retired. So thank you.
Okay. So you were last assigned to the Sacramento office.
That's correct.
All right. So why don't we start at the very beginning and talk a little bit about what you were doing before you joined the FBI, what interests you, why you joined the FBI, and then some of the other things that you did. We'll talk about what you're doing now, and then we will go back and talk about one of the cases, any case you want, one of the cases of your choice. So first of all,
sure.
What were you doing before you came into the FBI?
Sure. I was one of those kids, and strangely enough, there are a lot of us in the Bureau. I was a kid that was always interested in joining the Bureau. In fact, when I was about 14 years old, I wrote into Mr. Hoover, and I asked him to send me a booklet and information and what have you. And in fact, the agent misread the communication, and he called me up to ask me if I wanted a job.
And you were 14?
When I was 14. Only to find out that I was 14, and his reply was, "Okay, kid, we'll send you a booklet," and that was it. And so I was in New York at the time. I was going to school in New York City, and went, of course, to high school and college. And because I always had an interest in the Bureau, I went to Fordham University. And while attending Fordham University, I noticed a want ad on the bulletin board that said that they were in need of special assistance to do clerical work while they were going to school. And so I just thought that would be a great opportunity. And so I wrote into the Bureau. They sent me an application. I filled it out, and my father asked me one day, what am I doing? And I said, Dad, look, I got myself accepted. I'm being offered a job over at the FBI, and it literally bowled him away. And so while I was going to school at Fordham University, I had a part-time job. And the unfortunate thing there was they immediately, it wasn't long after joining that they said I had to work full-time too. And so literally I had 2 jobs. I went to school full-time and I worked for the Bureau full-time. So the Bureau had their offices over there on East 69th Street in New York. And so I would go to work there, and then I'd cross the park, Central Park, over to Fordham University at the Lincoln Law School over there, and would go to classes until I graduated.
And how long did you do both?
I did both until 1973. I joined, it was 69, and then it was 73. I became an agent.
So was this the entire time you were in college, practically, that you were also working? Wow.
Exactly. And I graduated in 72, and I stayed there for about another year before I got an appointment. And then I was just as pleased as punch as I got my appointment. There were a number of other folks there working at the Bureau and at the New York City office there. Likewise, sought an appointment, and they got one. And
could you explain to our listeners? Could you explain to our listeners about that program? Because you're right. At one time, many of the agents who came into the Bureau started out as clerks.
Sure. Mr. Hoover always wanted accountants and lawyers, and there were a third program, general program, where you could get in as long as you had certain experiences, which included clerical work at the Bureau or other experiences. And so I used those to get in. My backup was I was an accountant also, and so the funny story there is when it came time to get an appointment, they wanted to make me a special agent accountant. I turned it down, and I was pretty close friends with the assistant director, John Malone, at the time. And he said to me, because I drove for him on many occasions, and he said to me, I understand you turned down your appointment. What is that, you crazy? And,
why would you do that?
And I said, Mr. Malone, I joined the Bureau not to be an accountant, and because I really didn't understand. I was worried that I was always going to be doing accountant work. And so, of course, that's not the case. And so, but anyway, he understood.
So did you take up accounting in college just so you could get in the Bureau, but you really didn't want to do the work?
Yes, exactly. Strange as that may be, exactly. I just didn't want to do it. And so anyway, I got into the Bureau, and at the time, it used to be that you were involved in the Bureau did a lot of car theft rings, bank robberies, and that kind of thing. When I became an agent, I wanted to chase bank robbers. That was all I wanted to do. In fact, I wanted to go to...
That's the fun stuff, yeah.
Oh, sure. I wanted to go to Gary, Indiana, the home of John Dillinger, if you will, and chase bank robbers. And so I actually did go to Gary, Indiana, and I actually saw the jail where Dillinger was and what have you. They have a new jail there now, but it wasn't long after I got in that the Bureau changed. Mr. Hoover died, and it went from we needed to do more sophisticated financial crimes, and Director Kelly and Webster. They changed the priorities of the Bureau from to cars and the Communist Party. They worked that big at one point in time, and bank robberies, to white collar crime, organized crime, and public corruption.
And so these were not concentrations before when Hoover was alive. They changed after he died. Exactly.
They added a lot of resources. Mr. Hoover was criticized a number of occasions because he had been directed agents to a number of investigations that folks didn't feel were of the caliber that they thought the Bureau should be investigating. And so when Mr. Kelly and Mr. Webster came in, they changed the priorities. And for the first time, the Bureau had in its list, back in 1978, its list was white-collar crime, organized crime, and public corruption. And so, I quickly changed, not quickly, but I changed my focus into wanting to work bank robberies to realizing, well, it looks like the Bureau is heading in the direction of sophisticated long-term undercover operations. And so that's when I started to go in that direction. When you look at my career, it actually is, you can break it down into kind of three little levels. And that is, getting in, doing the bank robbery and general crimes, and then realizing undercover work. So then I did a lot of undercover work. And so that's kind of the first phase. And then the second phase, because of my experiences in being the undercover agent, I then decided, well, I'd like to be the case agent responsible for designing different undercover operations. And so I orchestrated a number of major undercover operations. And then in the latter part, I ran as I mentioned at the beginning of the program here, I managed the public corruption squad and the healthcare fraud squad. Okay.
So basically, you were in two offices, Gary, which is I guess a resident agency, an RA out of Indianapolis. Is that right?
Yeah. So what happened? I went from New York, transferred went to the training academy, and then I went first to Indianapolis. They had a policy there that they didn't let first office agents go to Gary, Indiana, because it was too much. They thought it was a dangerous place, if you will. And so I had to prove that I could work in that area. So they assigned me a 4-county area that I did, and after I completed that for a while, they said, all right, you can go to Gary. So then I went to Gary. And in Gary, Gary was a significant case because, as I mentioned, I was going from bank robberies to undercover work. And so I was introduced to a number of confidential informants, and I proposed to the Bureau that we do an undercover operation. Now, if you can imagine this, you have a young agent in Gary, Indiana, wanting to do an undercover operation, and the Bureau says, well, let's hear what you have to say, but probably not really. And so I gave them the parameters of the case, and they said, well, let's try it. And here's the interesting part of that case. Today's Bureau, agents who want to work undercover, they're given fictitious identities, they're given credit cards, in some instances they're given apartments and residences and others sophisticated cars, if you will. Mm-hmm. In those days, we didn't have any of that stuff. And so proposing this undercover operation was an organized crime figure I wanted to look at because he had defeated, the Bureau had lost a number of major criminal investigations taking him to court. And so I proposed this undercover operations. The funny part was I had an informant that could make the introduction, but we didn't have backup, meaning I didn't have fictitious identity. I didn't have an apartment. I didn't have other, means to kind of have a false front, if you will.
And so why? Why wasn't it? Why didn't you?
The Bureau didn't do that kind of sophisticated undercover stuff. We just did it. The Bureau did, short term, a day here, 2 days here, buy stolen property and that kind of thing. But they didn't entertain living with somebody or traveling extensively with somebody and having a false fictitious identity.
So what did you do? So how were you able to accomplish it?
Well, we did it, made the introduction, and in fact, it's one of the Bureau's early, long-term, sophisticated operations. It became successful. In fact, Director Webster picked it as at the time. They were changing the Bureau. As I said, Mr. Hoover died. They were changing the Bureau, and they introduced a new case management system. So the case was major case number 1, so that I could get resources and what have you.
Wow, so you're talking about this is the first major case number one. Wow.
This is major case number one. And it was codenamed, they codenamed it OPFOPEN, OPFOPEN, which is an acronym for Operation Fountain Pen. And what it was the Bureau's first real attack on organized crime and financial crime and using white-collar crime violations to prosecute people who were literally, setting up different criminal enterprises in foreign countries and then, using those enterprises in the United States to victimize banks, Wall Street, and what have you. And so literally, I got taken into their confidence, if you will, under my own name. The bad guys knew me living in my apartment up in Gary, Indiana, and I literally traveled around the world with these guys. I went to the Caribbean, overseas. I went to the beaches of Hawaii, and what the con men were doing, and that's what a good description of them. They were setting up offshore banks in the Caribbean, and the financial instruments that they were using, they were allowing the bad guys use to bust out big financial buildings that were being under construction, to do financial deals. In fact, one case involved a mortgage service company in New York City. So the bad guys had us fly into New York City, and in New York City, I was eating spaghetti with the mobsters down in Little Italy, and while we were negotiating, issuing bogus papers so that they could take over the mortgage service corporation.
Now, you said you're from New York. Were you afraid when you were in New York that you'd run into somebody you knew?
Well, it's always the problem. The Bureau was concerned about it. They tried to erase my identity a number of times because in doing the case, it involved a lot of money. This mortgage service company had $150 million loan portfolio. The bad guys, the Lucchese, Genovese, and the Gambino crime families wanted to use the mortgage company to fund street loans. And it was a $150 million loan portfolio, so it was a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And so while we're having these discussions, a couple of disagreements arose. There were a couple of contract hits that were put out. One suspect, we literally there was a $2.5 million stolen securities case where we had 4 witnesses that were going to testify, subpoenaed before the grand jury, that were eliminated, killed. And so the Bureau was extremely concerned about it.
And what about you? Was there ever a head out on you? Were you ever in fear of your life?
I was, it was always a concern. And again, let me remind, I don't think I've said this yet. I was with another agent, so there was 2 of us.
Okay.
The other agent, your viewers might be interested in hearing the story from his perspective. His name is Jack Brennan. And so, yes, we were always concerned, but we thought that we had it manageable. The bad guys, if you will, really liked me, and so I lived with one in particular, as I mentioned. His name is Phil Kitzer. In fact, the arrangement with him was such that when we finally arrested him down in Miami, I had to bring him out he was in Panama at the time, and he was actually negotiating to start a Panamanian bank down there. And I had to trick him to come out of Panama and meet us down in Miami. And before I met with him, we had another agent make the arrest. And one of the interesting things that came out of his mouth when he saw the agent that was placing him under his arrest because he had recognized him, he just said, "I want to let you know that Jimmy and Jack were not involved in this thing."
Oh, wow. So he was going out of his way to try to protect you.
Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
My goodness. So what happened when you finally found out that you were an undercover agent?
Well, he was extremely annoyed, as you might imagine, and upset. But that night, we talked for a while, a number of hours, old times. And the long and the short of it is, he went to prison and decided to cooperate, and actually got out of prison. And your listeners will be interested to hear this. Getting out of prison, he and I worked a number of undercover cases together, and actually had a very successful and enjoyable experience, if you will, because of our relationship. And he took down a number of the major.
I was going to say, this relationship you developed when you were undercover, after he got over the initial shock, kind of picked up and continued, but now on the other side of the law.
Exactly. And in fact, the relationship was such that right now there's an author, David Howard, is writing a book on it. It's called Chasing Phil, and Crown Publishing has bought it, and now the book has actually been sold and is being made into a movie just because of this unique relationship that we had. And again, your viewers can, do a web search and look for Chasing Phil, and you'll find that they're in the process of doing the book and the movie as we speak. And so, an interesting experience.
Yeah. So you were saying now, how long was it that you played this undercover role, and were hanging out with Phil Kitzer? You said.
Yes, his name is Kitzer, Kitzer. And the travels in the undercover phase lasted about a year. And so when I brought him out of Panama and had him fly into Miami, again, it was about a year. And so it's that period that the book covers and the movie is being made. You'll see that it's actually Robert Downey Jr. that's interested in playing the part of Phil Kitzer.
Oh, wow. Who's going to play you?
Well, I hope they find someone good. My luck, it will be just somebody.
So I'm fascinated that you're talking about all of these, traveling to foreign countries, because, many of the agents know that might be listening that when it comes to doing investigations, many times agents get to travel, to that particular area. But most of the time we send leads. So if you're in Philadelphia and you have an investigation that needs to be conducted in Oklahoma City, you send a lead and somebody in Oklahoma City does it. And that's a way to save money and on travel. But the Bureau was sending you all around the world. They were paying for that? Who was footing the bill?
Exactly. Well, at some points, the bad guys actually paid for the bill, and other times the Bureau did. A lot of times that case was became quickly overshadowed by another more famous case. It was called Abscam. And so a lot of the players that were involved in Abscam before that case were involved in my case. And so it was something that of a progression. You are right. And today we do that more often than not. All right. Then you needed almost a special committee of 3 Bureau executives to approve the travel. And so it was different and unique. But as I said, Director Kelly and Webster wanted to, propel the Bureau in this direction of using long-term sophisticated operations to get these organized crime networks. And they realized that, using informants was good for introductions, but in order for the evidence to stand up, they needed to have agents in place to do that work. And that's what we were doing. And that's the work that we started doing.
Okay, so you were one of the early pioneers of the Bureau's undercover program.
Exactly. And when I say undercover, like I say, there are a lot of guys that did some short-term undercover work. This thing lasted more than a year. We actually used my apartment as the place where the bad guys knew, I lived. I outfitted the apartment up with some special banking equipment so that we could communicate back and forth. And so, the Bureau did not think it was going to work. And after each meeting, it just did. And so when they saw that it, success begets success, they said, well, let's pick this one. And so that's why they made it major case number one. And before I knew it, we were getting some money, resources, and agents. So it was
during
a great
this,
case.
Yeah, and during this year that you were undercover, did you go into the office? Yes,
I did. In fact, I mentioned Chase and Phil. There are a number of things I'm going to leave to the Bureau for your listeners to be thinking about, but that work, trying to work undercover and at the same time come into the office at different times, cause problems, and that will be included in that story if your viewers are interested.
Oh, very good, very good. Yeah, it sounds like it would make a unbelievable story just to talk about, again, the relationship that you developed with this Phil Kitzer, again, with him thinking that you're one of the bad guys along with him. And then later on, him finding out and then, teaming together on the other side. Could you tell us a little bit about that? So after he goes to jail, he goes to jail for 10 years?
He's sentenced. He's actually one of the few Bureau subjects, if you will. And I think your viewers will know, your listeners will know this, if they're the FBI agents, that he actually pled to 6 federal convictions. One of them, I might add, and this is one of the stories that we're going to talk about, is the group in New York City also stole Elvis Presley's Learjet. And so...
How did they manage? It's kind of hard to visualize somebody stealing a jet.
Exactly. But they did accomplish it. In fact, that's one of the cases that Mr. Kitzer pled to. And so... The story is quite incredible, and the Memphis division actually charged everybody that were responsible in stealing Mr. Presley's jet. At the time, I think it had a value of $6 million, and so one of the stories that we talk about is the subjects in New York. They actually talked about what they did when they stole the jet, and so the unfortunate thing was, which was incredible also at the time, this case occurred in 1977, and so when we were undercover, and so that was about the time that Elvis Presley passed away, and so it was pretty heightened interest, if you will, and so. As I said, there were a number of offshoot investigations that we got involved in that at the time were just incredible. When we were in Hawaii, one of the principals involved was the first lieutenant governor of Hawaii, where they had actually ripped off almost $100,000 from them. And when we were down in Southern California, we got involved in, at the time, the New York Daily News reported it as the largest theft, the armored robbery in the United States involving, I think they estimated several $1 million, if you will. And so the investigation, as I said, had just sparked a number of, it might have been luck, that we got into these different corners of organized crime, and Mr. Kelly and Director Webster said this is a good operation to use as our number one, example that we want agents to pursue. And so we got the title Major Case 1.
Yeah. So I need just to get a better understanding of what you did, because now you're undercover. I would imagine that you are participating in some type of illegal activity, of the actual selling of these fictitious and bogus securities. What are you doing, and how did that affect the case when it came time to charge and prosecute the other people involved?
And that was another problematic area that we had to deal with. And we could not be involved in a crime that we knew was going down. And so if we knew the circumstances of the crime, the details, we would try to prevent it. And so it was those situations where we had to prevent the crime that, again, produced this incredible story. And was very problematic because, again, we could not let a crime go down if we knew it was going to go down. We'd have agents intercept, conduct interviews, knock on doors if we felt that something was going on that was going to result in somebody getting hurt or they were going to lose their money. We'd give them a warning. As in in one instance in Cleveland where the mobsters actually had put out a contract at an individual, we actually had the bureau go on out to the person's residence, and we warned them that the contract had been put out, and actually we were able to by just getting that out, we were able to convince the bad guys that maybe they better not do that today because the feds are looking. And so. And
nobody was ever suspicious that you were, even if they thought you were undercover, did they think you were cooperating in some way?
Myself and this other guy, the other agent, Jack Brennan, we were called Junior G-men because one of the principals, Mr. Kitzer himself, at one point looked at us and compared us as the agents that were usually conducting interviews. And so, but it was the groundwork that we did before we actually met Mr. Kitzer that convinced him that we were not federal agents. In fact, there's a conversation with him where he explains to me, he used to call me Jimmy, and he explains to me, Jimmy, I know you're not a Fed, and the reason I know that is because when I always returned your phone call in the early days of our relationship, you would never call me back. And he was such a crime figure, familiar with prosecutors by name, that he thought that had he called a real FBI agent, they would have called him back immediately, simply because they would be able to do so without his lawyers present. And so the fact that I never did that was his reason that I couldn't be. And so you have it. And it was an incredible story. But we did that, and I worked a number of undercover cases, and then lo and behold, I thought, well, you know what? I want to put my information, my talents to use to orchestrate undercover operations. And so when I got out to California, they moved me out to California because I got involved with all the hitmen. And
so they moved you out there for your own protection?
Exactly. Exactly. And that's how the teletype read. And so I moved out here, and while we moved out here, and lo, the newspapers are filled with California corruption, public corruption. The legislators are taking money. And so we designed a 3-year undercover probe involving the state legislature, where we actually introduced bogus legislation before the state body, and had it passed. In fact, it was passed twice. We introduced the measure on 2 separate years, and we paid different bribes that resulted in a number of state legislators being charged and prosecuted. The number is we actually convicted 4 state senators and the Assembly minority leader.
Wow!
And a number of lesser figures. The total, I think, is 14 individuals. And so.
What was the year for this? When were you working on this case?
The undercover phase was 1985 to 1988, and then we went over it when we executed search warrants at the Capitol. I could not believe the media response. It literally filled up one side of closed files, and we were getting calls from everywhere, from Eastern Europe to London, from the BBC to Australia. And the SAC was just shaking his head. But the case, the newspaper people nicknamed it shrimp scam. So your viewers can just
well, why now you got to tell us why. Why shrimp scam? You're in Sacramento,
Sure. Well, I gave it another name. All right. I'm not even going to bore you with the other name. Well, I'll tell you, it was for bribery special interest. But they didn't like that, and so what happened is we had to. It was a very technical thing. If you can imagine, I'm submitting legislation before a state body here, so we were looking for industrial development bonds to build a restaurant that sold shrimp goods here in California, imported from Mobile, Alabama. So we needed that interstate connection to have a federal jurisdiction, if you will. And so the imported goods was going to be shrimp. And so that's how the bill was written. And the bill was a technical piece of language that when you looked at it only pertained to one company. In fact, it was the one when we approached the director to consider doing the investigation, the one requirement that he mandated was that it had to be, and this was Mr. Webster, it had to be clear to him that it pertained to no one else but this shrimp company. And so that's what we did. We were able to do that, and
he didn't want you to accidentally snag another business that may not have had had established a need to put out bribes. I'm not sure what you're.
That he did not want the bill because it got benefits that nobody else could get. All right.
Oh, I see.
He did not want a third. Okay. Yes, if it passed, he did not want a third-party person to get those benefits that we were getting simply because we were paying bribes to elected officials.
Okay. All right. So he didn't want you to actually affect. He did not want you to actually have an effect on the legislation for California. He wanted something.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Now, did you have people that you knew were taking bribes, and so you created this company just to see or to provide evidence that they were accepting bribes? I mean, who was your target, and how did you develop that?
I had to, if you will, the magic word of the Bureau is predicate an investigation. And so I had to show the director and his subordinates that we had clear information that the parties that we were approaching were probably engaged in corrupt activities, probable cause, and therefore we could approach them with a confidential source and an undercover agent. Okay. And once we did that, we were able to meet with them for a limited period of time, and if they asked for monies or bribes, then we could ask for money and get the money and then pay off the bribes, which is what happened.
All right, and I happen to know that this case was a major case, so major you actually received the Director's Award for conducting outstanding criminal investigation for this case. So congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it was. It was when I realized, when I look back today, that it took 3 years, the undercover phase. I always thought that somehow the investigation itself would leak out, but when it didn't leak out, when that secret remained protected for 3 years, I couldn't believe it. But it did result in us being able to introduce the legislation. We actually, if you can imagine, we actually convinced a number of elected and officials that we paid bribes to and others that we didn't to vote for the measure, and it actually got approved and passed and sent to the governor's desk. And so we actually had to go to the governor, Deukmejian at the time, Governor Deukmejian, and tell him that the legislation he was considering to sign was our legislation. And of course, as you might imagine, he rolled his eyes. And he did not sign the legislation. And what he couldn't believe, because we did that in 1986, what he couldn't believe was that in 1988 we came back and did it again and had to visit his office again to tell him that the legislation that he was about to sign was our bill again, and he again just couldn't believe it.
It's amazing that that it would get that far, that those bribes worked so well that this bogus legislation reached up to the governor's desk, like you said, twice. Now, there's another benefit. You got an award for working this case, but you also got something else for working this case, and that was a wife.
That's probably my better side.
Maybe I'll get your co-case agent or the agent who worked those cases, your wife Nancy, to come on FBI Retired Case File Review.
I told her, I gave her a heads up. I thought you might be calling. In fact, I'll tell you a little story. When we did get married, it was in the middle of the shrimp scam case. In one of those little, odd pieces that you see in a newspaper, one of the major newspapers, they had a little section, and they mentioned, well, today, here's one for you. You remember the shrimp scam case? Well, the two we're investigating are now husband and wife. And so, yeah, she is my better
half. You made
the news. I made the news. Yeah, she'd love to hear from you.
All right, so we've been talking for a while, and it's been really fascinating, but I do want to make sure that you have talked about everything that you want to talk about as far as your bureau career, and then I want to talk just a little bit about what you're doing now.
Sure.
Do you have any other cases or thoughts you want to?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
9/11 happened, of course, and we all had to work terrorism, and so, but the bureau, because I had an expertise in organized crime and white collar crime, they let me do the healthcare fraud program, and so just before I retired, I was able to do a number of investigations where our work resulted in securing more stats than most other field offices, including New York and Los Angeles.
Wow.
We were able to provide to prosecute more than 300 medical providers for defrauding, if you can believe this, almost $250 million, $250 million, which today might be small change, but then it was pretty big change. And it was such a big investigation that Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes wanted to do a 60 Minutes program on it, and he did. And so I'm proud of the work that, and that work itself, I ran the squad, but it was the agents on the squad that actually pulled those stats together and went out and prosecuted and was able to do the investigation that resulted in the prosecutions that got those incredible stats. And it was a great way to end a great career. It was one of the best things I ever did in my life. It was very rewarding. I think you and I spoke before, when you look back, I was almost an agent for 35 years, and so I spent most of my life working for the Bureau. I think it's a great professional career for anybody.
Absolutely. And so now, what are you doing?
Well, now I'm retired, but of course I can't give it up, and so I do work as an outside expert. I have a consulting practice, and I run a website for retired agents. It's a great network. You're a member of the network.
Yes, I am. After every episode, I actually promote it. I said the show's sponsored by, and all that means is that you're a friend of mine and I support you. And if anybody wants to join or find out information or find agents, retired agents, then FBIRetired.com is linked right on my website.
That's right, and I thank you very much for that.
All right. Well, this has been fascinating. Corruption and white-collar crime, that's what I did, for my entire career. So it's nice to have one of those cases on. I've done a lot of, kidnapping and bank robbery, but we do so much in the FBI, and one of the goals of my show is to make sure people get an understanding of all the things that FBI agents do. So I really, really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much, Jim.
Thanks for calling and asking me to participate. I loved it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we'll have the links to some of your cases, and we'll have some really great photos on jerrywilliams.com so people can come and take a look there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later. And that's the end of the show. Don't forget that photos and links to newspaper articles related to this interview can be found at jerrywilliams.com. Today's episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Reviews with Jerry Williams. Thank you.